The crowbar slipped the first time. Callum Dearborn's hands were shaking. Not from cold, though the old farmhouse had held February's chill in its bones for just over 2 weeks now, ever since the funeral. He repositioned the iron tip beneath the plank, the one his father had warned him about. Never pull that one up, son. Some things are better left where they are. He'd been 11 years old when Everett Dearborn said that, standing in the doorway of the locked back room with a look Callum had never quite understood. Tonight, with a certified letter from a real estate firm sitting on the kitchen table and a closing date printed in bold at the bottom, he finally understood. He pressed down on the crowbar. The old nail screamed as it released, and as the plank lifted free, something slid out from the darkness beneath it. A manila envelope, stained with age, sealed with a strip of packing tape that had gone brittle and brown. Callum's breath stopped. He reached in. The envelope was heavier than it looked, and whatever was inside had been waiting a very long time for someone to find it. If stories about family, forgotten land, and quiet battles for justice mean something to you, subscribe so you never miss one. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. These stories reach further than you might expect, and I love knowing. Callum Dearborn was 43 years old and had spent the last 16 of those years running a landscape architecture firm in Columbus, Ohio. He was the kind of man who answered emails on Sunday mornings and kept a meticulous planner, the kind of man who had quietly promised himself he would make it back to Harlan County, Kentucky more often. He hadn't. The calls home had gotten shorter. The visits had stretched from every few months to twice a year, then once. When his father Everett died in late January, quietly, in his sleep, the way people say good men go, Callum drove down in the dark and arrived before sunrise and stood in the doorway of the farmhouse like a stranger. Everett Dearborn had worked the orchard alone for the last decade. 62 acres of apple trees spreading across a hillside that caught the eastern light perfectly, something Everett had once explained at length about how morning sun dried the dew before the fungal spores could take hold, how the slope provided natural drainage that kept the root zone from waterlogging in wet springs. He grew 8 heirloom varieties, including a strain of winesap that an agricultural extension agent had once told him was among the oldest continuously cultivated apple lines in the eastern Appalachians. Everett had nodded politely and gone back to pruning. He already knew. The orchard had been in the Dearborn family for 4 generations. It was not a wealthy operation. But Everett had always said that an orchard wasn't a business so much as a promise. You made commitments to trees that would outlive you. You managed soil you didn't own in any meaningful sense, and you passed the whole conversation forward to someone who would carry it on. Callum had grown up understanding that. He had also grown up and left, and now someone wanted to buy the land, and the paperwork suggested he had no legal standing to refuse. The letter had come from a firm called Aldridge Property Solutions, based in Lexington. A man named Preston Aldridge had driven up himself 2 days after the funeral, polished shoes, measured condolences, a leather folder containing an offer that Callum would later learn was roughly 60% of the land's market value. Aldridge explained, carefully and almost gently, that Everett had signed a right of first refusal agreement in 2019, binding the estate to sell to Aldridge's firm if the land changed hands within 10 years. He produced a notarized copy. The signature looked right. The legal language was airtight. Callum had called an attorney in Hazard, who reviewed the document and called him back with the kind of careful silence that precedes bad news. "It looks enforceable," she'd said, "unless you can find something that contradicts it." That was when Callum started going through the house, looking for the one thing that might save it, the original deed. He searched for 3 days. Every drawer in the kitchen, every shelf in the barn, every manila folder in the file cabinet in his father's study. The deed was not there. Not in the lockbox under the bed, not in the tobacco tin on the workbench, not in the stack of papers beside the telephone. It had been recorded with the county in 1923, and Callum had found the county's filing reference in an old property tax statement. But the physical document, the one his father had kept somewhere in this house, for as long as Callum could remember, was gone. Whether Everett had moved it, lost it, or whether someone had taken it, Callum couldn't say. All he knew was that without it, and without anything to challenge the forged agreement, the closing would proceed in 18 days. He found the first journal under the workbench in the barn, tucked behind a coffee can full of grafting tape and pruning sealant. Everett had never been a sentimental man. He expressed things practically, through actions, through the way he'd press a cutting into your hand and say, "Watch how the cambium aligns." So the journal surprised him. The entries were sparse and factual, dated irregularly. But 3 entries from 2019 stopped him cold. "Aldridge's people came again today. 3rd time this month. I told them the same thing I always tell them. This land isn't for sale." A week later, they sent a different man this time, younger. Said it was about estate planning. I told him I had my affairs in order. He left a card. I threw it away. And then, 6 weeks later, an entry with no preamble at all, signed nothing, "Don't intend to." There is something about these offers that doesn't sit right. I'm going to call Dale Whitmore at the county clerk's office and ask him to look at the original deed. Callum read that last line 3 times. Then he called Dale Whitmore, who had served as county clerk for 22 years and had known Everett since boyhood. Dale's voice went quiet when Callum explained why he was calling. "Your daddy did come to see me," Dale said slowly, "back in the fall of 2019. He was asking about the deed and about a survey discrepancy he'd noticed. I told him I'd look into it, and then about a week later, our office had a water main break, flooded the records room, lost a lot of paper files from that era. I always meant to call your father back." Dale paused. "I don't suppose I ever did. The tip came from an unexpected direction. A neighbor, old Ruth Ann Pruitt, from 2 miles up the road, stopped by that afternoon with food, the way neighbors do, and mentioned casually that Everett had been doing some work in the back room the previous autumn, had a contractor out here. I saw the truck, but Everett told me it was just settling floorboards." She'd shrugged. "Seemed strange is all. He never fixed anything he didn't have to." Callum thanked her, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood in the hallway for a long moment. He had already searched that room once. He had not looked beneath the floor. That night, Callum went back to the locked room. The room had been used as a study, though Everett had always kept it private. A desk, a file cabinet, shelves of agricultural manuals and seed catalogs going back to the 1970s. He had already checked every surface, every drawer. But the floor was different now, that he knew someone had been under it. Callum stood in the room, crowbar in hand, and found the plank. He peeled back the brittle tape with fingers that were steadier now than they'd been 10 minutes ago. Inside the envelope were 3 items. The first was a handwritten note in his father's careful script. "Callum, if you're reading this, I expect you've been looking for this a while. I moved it here when Aldridge's people started coming around. Couldn't risk it going missing. The agreement they'll show you is not legitimate. Compare the notary stamps." The second item stopped Callum's breath entirely. It was the original land deed, the document he had spent 3 days searching for, formally recorded in 1923, when his great-grandfather had consolidated the family's holdings into a single title, tracing 4 generations of Dearborn ownership in an unbroken line with no encumbrances, no agreements, no rights of first refusal. Everett hadn't lost it. He had hidden it deliberately, right under the floorboard he'd warned his son never to touch. The third item was a letter from a title research firm in Frankfurt, dated October 2019, stating that they had conducted a chain of title search on the Dearborn property at Everett's request and found no recorded agreements affecting sale rights, and that the notary, whose name appeared on the Aldridge document, had surrendered her commission in 2017, 2 years before the document was supposedly executed. The agreement was a forgery. Callum sat on the bare subfloor in the cold room for a long time. He thought about his father standing in this same room, holding these same papers, making a decision about where to put them and what to write on the note. Everett had known someone might come. He had known the agreement would surface. He had not told Callum directly, because Everett Dearborn had been a man who believed you should find things out for yourself, should follow the evidence the way you follow a drainage problem back to its source. But he had left everything Callum needed. He had hidden it in the one place he'd told his son to leave alone, knowing that instruction would become, eventually, the very thing that drew his attention there. The attorney in Hazard, her name was Greta Sovine, spent 48 hours on the phone with Callum, the title firm in Frankfurt, and the Kentucky State Bar's Notary Commission office before she called him back, with the kind of controlled excitement lawyers allow themselves when they know they've won. The notary whose stamp appeared on Aldridge's document had not only surrendered her commission in 2017, she had filed a complaint the year before that, in 2016, against an unnamed Lexington property firm for attempting to use her credentials without authorization, and had surrendered her commission shortly afterward to prevent further misuse. That complaint had been settled quietly. But it was a matter of record. Preston Aldridge arrived at the farmhouse 3 days before the scheduled closing, with 2 associates, and what Callum suspected was a prepared explanation. Callum met him on the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He handed Aldridge a single sheet of paper, a letter from Greta Sovine's office, carbon copied to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department and the Kentucky Attorney General's Real Estate Fraud Division, summarizing the title research findings and the Notary Commission records. Aldridge read it once. Then he read it again. His face went through several arrangements before settling into something that was neither calm nor collected. He left without speaking. The closing never happened. Within 6 weeks, a state investigation had been opened into Aldridge Property Solutions, and Callum learned from a reporter covering the story that the firm had used similar tactics on at least 3 other rural landowners in eastern Kentucky over the previous 4 years, 2 of whom had already sold, believing the agreements to be legitimate. The orchard survived the winter. In early March, Callum drove back down from Columbus with his pruning shears, and he spent 4 days working through the rows the way his father had taught him, cutting back to the outward-facing buds, removing the water sprouts, letting light into the canopy. Liberty Hyde Bailey, the great American horticulturist, once wrote that the love of gardening is a seed that once sown never dies. Standing in those rows, Callum understood that for the first time, not as a sentiment, but as a practical truth. His father had planted something in him that had lain dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions to break through. He did not move back permanently, not right away, but he hired a farm manager, a young man from Leslie County, named Dex Holcomb, who had studied horticulture at UK and wanted nothing more than to work with heirloom varieties on hillside ground. Together, they developed a plan to expand the Winesap block and apply for a heritage orchard designation through the state agricultural department, which would provide both grant support and a degree of legal protection for the land going forward. The first season under Dex's management saw a 20% improvement in yield, in part because Dex caught an early outbreak of fire blight in the northeast block and contained it with a copper spray before it spread, something Callum's father had always been vigilant about, because in an apple orchard, 1 season of neglect can cost you 5 years of recovery. The manila envelope now sits in a fireproof lockbox at Greta Sovine's office, alongside a certified copy of the original deed, properly recorded with the county clerk. Dale Whitmore personally oversaw the filing. He told Callum afterward that he'd been carrying a quiet guilt about that unreturned phone call for 4 years, and that seeing the deed recorded felt like something finally set right. Callum told him that his father had never been the kind of man to hold a grudge against an honest mistake. That was true. It was also, Callum had come to understand, only part of the truth. His father had been a man of extraordinary patience, the kind of patience that comes from working with living things on their own timelines, from understanding that an apple tree grafted this spring won't bear its first full crop for 3 years, and won't reach its peak for 15. Everett had planted trees he knew he would never see at their best. He had documented his land, hidden his evidence, written his note, and trusted that eventually his son would come looking. He had been right. The land carries the memory of the people who care for it, not in any mystical sense, but in the most practical one, in the shape of the pruning cuts, in the varieties chosen, in the drainage channels dug by hand across a hillside one quiet autumn 30 years ago. The deed was never really lost. It was waiting, the way the orchard itself had always been waiting, patient, root-bound, faithful to a future that hadn't arrived yet. Some things buried deep enough become permanent, and some fathers, even gone, still know exactly where to leave what their children will need. What's hidden in plain sight, under a floorboard, in a coffee can, in a locked room, is rarely hidden from love. It's hidden from impatience. The lesson Callum Dearborn carried out of that farmhouse isn't about property law or forged documents. It's simpler than that. The people who care for the land longest are the ones who know it deepest, and that knowledge has a way of surviving everything that tries to erase it.